I'm one of the pastors here at Horizon Church, and it's great to have you in worship with us today. Thank you for spending your Sunday with us. Oh, you're stepping back out of the spray zone?
Yeah.
We're gonna start off, and I want to play a little bit of a game here with you. I want you to imagine 100 years from now. 100 years from now, what are people saying about you? How have they remembered you? July 28th? 2124. What are people saying about you? You imagine that your great-grandchildren, maybe great-great-grandchildren, are gathered up and they're telling stories about you. What are the things they're saying? Are they telling stories about that car you drove? Maybe, but probably not. Are they telling about your job title? Possibly. Are they talking about how big your house was? Doubtful. The stories that they're probably telling in 100 years about you are how you lived your life. The impact that you had on other people, the way you invested in them, how you lived out your faith. Today we're going to look at a story, the continuation really of a story that we started last week about a guy named Joseph. We're closing out our series today on Genesis, and we are going to be in the last chapter of Genesis, Genesis 50. And so last week we met this guy named Joseph, and here's the thing. The story that we read about Joseph, a guy that lived a little over 3,000 years ago, there's no mention of his great sense of Egyptian fashion. There's no mention of how great an administrator he was of Egyptian politics. What there is the way that his life impacted other people, the way his faith brought blessing to him, his family, and so many others. And so today we're going to be continuing that story of Joseph. When we met Joseph last week, we talked about how he was the 11th of 12 brothers, and he happened to be his father Jacob's favorite. You may remember he's the one with he gets the fancy coat of many colors, and he thought pretty highly of himself, and it drew kind of the ire of his brothers. And his brothers schemed against him one day, and they were out and they threw him in a pit, and then they doubted whether that was maybe the best way to kill their brother out in a pit, and so they got a better idea. They were like, at least let's get some money for selling him, so some traders going by. And Joseph then makes his way into Egypt, and he has a pretty rough go of it in Egypt at first. He gets accused, he gets thrown in prison, and eventually he makes his way up to one of the top officials for Pharaoh. And that's where we met him last week. And his brothers eventually make their way down into Egypt because there's a famine in the land of Canaan. And it's there, at this encounter with his brothers, that Joseph, who had been preparing for this famine so that they would have plenty of food in Egypt, his brothers make their way to Egypt, and he recognizes them, and he reveals himself to them. And it's in that first encounter that Joseph shows forgiveness to his brothers. But here's the thing, when we pick up today's story and the 5 chapters that have happened, one key thing has happened. And it's that their father, Jacob, has now died. And so the brothers are again fearful that forgiveness won't last with Joseph. That maybe he was only being nice to them at that moment because their father was still alive. But now, at the end of the story, Jacob has died, and they're again fearful for their life, that Joseph will take revenge for what they had done to him so many years ago. So we're going to read here from chapter 50. If you got your Bibles with you, feel free to open it up, or you can pull it out on your phone. I'm a huge fan of the Bible app. It's totally free. I don't get any referral bonus for that. So please go ahead and download it if you don't have it, so that way you can always have a Bible with you. Genesis chapter 50 here, starting at the 15th verse. It says, "When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong we did to him?' So they sent word to Joseph saying, 'Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God of your father.' When their message came to Joseph, when they came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers came and threw themselves down before him. 'We are your slaves,' they said." So you see right here, Jacob has died, and they are filled with fear. They're throwing themselves down, and it's just the same thing that happened in chapter 45 we read last week. They throw themselves down before him because they are scared of what might happen to them. And catch this response from Joseph. "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." Did you catch what a different response the brothers got than what they were expecting? All the while, Joseph saw God's hand on his life. Joseph wasn't just being nice to allow them to have food. Now, you might be thinking, Chris, like Joseph's life is a little bit like a bestseller here, like it has the happy ending, but you don't quite understand my life. My life's a little different. It doesn't have quite the same plot line that Joseph experienced. But I think we forget the challenges and the struggles and the journey that Joseph was on. Again, he was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused. He was forgotten in prison. He wasn't exactly living his best life. But he chose to see beyond those circumstances and to see what God might do in his life next. He chose to create a legacy for himself and for his family and for many. There are three keys from this story that Joseph creates and how he treats his brothers. The first is that he chose forgiveness over bitterness. And if you weren't here last week, I invite you to go back and listen to the message from last week because we really dug into what forgiveness looks like in this story. But it's the first step to creating a legacy that lasts, that Joseph creates here for his brothers and for many. I want to tell you the story of Immaculée. Immaculée survived the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Immaculée, she survived for 91 days after watching her family die. Her mother and her brother were murdered, and she stayed for 91 days in a small bathroom, about a 4-by-6 room with 7 other women for 91 days. She stayed in the bathroom of the house of a pastor that welcomed her in and protected her and these 7 other women. After 91 days of being confined and cooped up and of witnessing the atrocities of a genocide, she had some bitterness. She had a lot of anger. She got out and wanted to seek revenge for what she had experienced. And that bitterness continued to grow inside of her. and she couldn't move on. And she was encouraged to spend time in prayer and reflection. And it was through that process that she grew the forgiveness in her heart. So much so that she actually met and offered forgiveness to the very person she had watched slaughter her brother and her mother. And it was from that moment that she was able then to offer forgiveness the rest of her life, to learn this habit of forgiveness through prayer and reflection. She was able to let go of the bitterness that she had so much harbored from those 91 days. And here's the thing, she discovered her purpose in that, is that so many of us struggle with forgiveness as well. And she was able to use her own story, her own journey, to share it with others. And she found a purpose in that. And Joseph, in forgiving his brothers, was able to discover his own purpose. Yes, he did have some great administrative skills in Egyptian politics, but his purpose for that moment was to store up food for the coming famine, that he would save many people. He had a purpose that went beyond himself, and he was able to do it because he didn't hold a grudge against his brothers. The second thing here is that Joseph was able to see beyond his own circumstances. There's this powerful statement, and if you've been in church before, you've probably heard it here in verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. I'm in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." In the face of our challenges, are we willing to look beyond the circumstances that we can see today of what God might be doing? There was a meteorologist named Edward Lawrence. And Edward Lawrence was doing those like modeling of storms. I have to imagine all those spaghetti lines that we are familiar with here as Floridians in the summer. They kind of scatter and they go different directions, and we're not really sure, but they kind of put them all together, and then you're in the cone of like certainty. It's like going to certainly go this way, but it could go some other different directions. And as Edward was playing with the models of weather, he discovered that by changing a number to the math teachers, I had to think about this week, to the thousandth place. So that's like not just 0.1, not just 0.01, but 0.001. By changing numbers in the meteorological models by 0.001, he started to see what huge variations there could be by changing just what seems to us such a small number. And if you know anything about science, I know I have at least one science teacher and I have multiple teachers, and there's some things like Newton's third law, right? And what is Newton's third law? Anyone remember back from like high school physics? Newton's third law, right? So, if you push something, it's going to have an equal and opposite reaction. And so what Edward kind of started seeing is that these really small numbers, these really small changes were actually having not an equal and opposite reaction. A very small change was having a great change on the other side. And it went in to change up how we thought of science to a certain extent. And this grew is what grows into the what we know as the butterfly effect. And it's this theory, right, that the wind created just the quiet breeze of a butterfly, off the coast somewhere, stirs things up just enough that it creates something like a hurricane on the other side of the world. And it goes against this third law that there's always an equal and opposite reaction to everything. And we see in this story of Joseph, small decisions having much greater impact in how people move forward. See, here's the thing. As we close out Genesis is really, can be broken down into two sections. There's the first 12 books of first 12 chapters of Genesis, and then there's 12 through 50. Because in chapter 12 is where God makes this promise to Abraham and Sarah, makes that covenant with them. There's been a lot of follies as we followed Abraham's family since then, but God made this promise that he would bless Abraham. And why did God bless Abraham, it says? So that Abraham could be a blessing to many. So that Abraham could be a blessing to many. And we've talked about how Abraham made some silly mistakes, and he lied about his wife being really his sister, or his sister. He called Sarah his sister when she was really his wife. They tried to circumvent some ways God was working in their life, and we see this big folly here when the brothers do this to Joseph. But yet, the purpose of their blessing, this one particular family, continues on, that they would be a blessing to others. And Joseph was able to see beyond his circumstances to live out that promise. And so Joseph uses his life to bless others. He invested in others beyond himself. This week, I had the opportunity for a very brief, I think it was even ended up being less than 24-hour reunion with with two of my best friends from seminary. They were both in our wedding, and they were formational in my own life. I went to seminary, and I think if you often think of someone that was going to go to seminary, like they are just like completely sold out to be a pastor. And that was not the case for me. I had heard God's call in my life, and I said yes, and I stepped into that. But I was still filled with doubts. I still was filled with just the lack of confidence that this was where I was to be. And I stepped into that first day of orientation, and sort of like the butterfly effect in a way, I met these two guys, and we bonded over, if you know me at all, it's not a surprise. We bonded over college football, particularly SEC football. We all had our own teams. One of us was a Mississippi State fan, one of us was a South Carolina fan, and I was a Florida fan. And it was that first day of bonding over football that got beyond just the things that we were there for. Rhett ended up, I didn't know it at the time, that first day, he lived like across the hall from me in the apartment building that we lived in. And that place became a hub for us. Those 3 years in seminary of reflection, I had a lot of questions. They were much more further down the line in their commitment of sorts to being a pastor. And they poured into me in that moment, invested in me and my questions, my doubts, and they reassured me along the way. They didn't know that there would be a horizon at that point. And in just the same way, I was able to invest in them. And I reflect this week when we got to spend some time with Justin, who was actually the best man in our wedding. He's a pastor of a kind of a rural church. He's from Mississippi. And the building next to the church it has a particular word for it, where someone kind of overpays for sub-level of housing, and it's not particularly a nice term. And this building next to the church, Justin had a vision for what it could be. And talk about, walls crumbling down. The church did that. They took the house down. And Justin's church is situated across the street from the community food bank that's set up. It looks just like a grocery store. And so the church, the food bank, and now this empty lot. And Justin, as a pastor of a church in a small town, was faced with this question of like, we could sell this lot for $200,000 or $300,000 and it would definitely help the budget long term. But are we going to do that to invest in ourselves? And so Justin partnered with the food bank across the street and a community farm in the area. And so now that plot of land that was once substandard housing that someone was overcharging for someone to live there is now filled with garden beds where they just this week harvested 50 pounds of lettuce that went across the street to the community food bank that most likely a senior citizen in the community got to take home. His church invested beyond what they could see today with that piece of property. We don't quite know what the butterfly effect will be on those that are receiving those blessings. And so we today have to ask ourselves that original question that we spoke of today. What will people remember about you in 100 years? Will they remember someone that chose forgiveness over bitterness? Someone who saw God's hand even in the face of challenges? Will they see someone that invested in others? As we wrap up today, there is a legacy of someone who chose forgiveness, who saw beyond the circumstances and invested in others and made the ultimate sacrifice in Jesus. His legacy continues today. It continues to transform the world around us. And here's the amazing thing. We have an opportunity to be a part of that legacy. To continue the work of reconciliation, to bring hope to the world, to shine light and ignite change. What can you do this week to build that legacy? What is one step you can take to write your legacy this week? What is one thing you can do to make it worthwhile, that someone will remember that legacy in you? Would you join me in prayer? Heavenly Father, Almighty King, we ask right now that we would have the courage to take one step to make a lasting legacy in our lives for those around us. God, give us the wisdom right now to know what that step is. God, that step to choose forgiveness over bitterness, to see beyond the circumstances, to see that your hand is on us right now so that we can invest in other people. God, we thank you that you have shown the way, that you took the path of forgiveness, that you saw that there was a greater plan, and that you chose to love us in spite of all the ways that we reject you. God, we thank you for your love and your grace that surrounds us.